I was only 22 when my grandfather shattered my world the night before my wedding day. The man I trusted most in this world became my worst nightmare when I needed him to walk me down the aisle. Hi there, my beautiful souls. My name is Rose, but everyone calls me Grandma Rose. I'm 72 years old, born and raised here in Springfield, Ohio, back in 1952. Today I'm sharing something I've kept buried in my heart for 50 years. A secret so dark that I've never spoken it aloud, not even to my own husband during our 48 years of marriage. If you're here with me today, please know that your presence gives me strength to finally speak my truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You know, some stories begin with fairy tales, but mine started as one and turned into something else entirely. I grew up believing I was the luckiest girl in Springfield. My grandfather Harold, who everyone called Grandpa Harry, was my hero. He stood 6 feet tall with silver hair that caught the sunlight, warm brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and hands that could fix anything broken. He lived on a beautiful farm just outside our little town, surrounded by rolling green fields, and a red barn that looked like it belonged on a postcard. My parents, Carol and Robert, worked long hours at the textile mill downtown. Dad operated the heavy machinery while Mom worked in the office doing bookkeeping. They left before sunrise and returned after sunset, which meant I spent most of my childhood at Grandpa Harry's farm. Those were supposed to be the golden years of my life. Grandpa Harry would pick me up from school in his old blue pickup truck, the one with the dent in the side door and the radio that only played country music. We'd drive down the dusty road to his farm while he told me stories about the old days, about how he built that farm with his own 2 hands after coming back from the war. Grandma Maggie had passed away when I was only 5, so it was just Grandpa Harry and me most afternoons. He taught me how to feed the chickens, how to milk the cows, how to plant vegetables in neat rows in his garden. I learned to drive his old tractor when I was barely tall enough to reach the pedals. He'd sit beside me, his weathered hand steady, on the wheel when I got scared, telling me I was brave and smart and could do anything I set my mind to. Those summer evenings on the farm felt like pure magic. We'd sit on his front porch swing, eating ice cream from the freezer in town, watching fireflies dance in the twilight while he played his harmonica. When I turned 16, I met James at a church social. Jim was 18, tall and lean with sandy brown hair and the kindest blue eyes I'd ever seen. He worked at his father's hardware store and had plans to take over the business someday. Grandpa Harry took to Jim immediately, which meant everything to me. He'd invite Jim to Sunday dinners at the farm, teaching him about engines and carpentry, treating him like the grandson he never had. I remember watching them work together in the barn, their heads bent over some broken piece of machinery, and thinking this was what happiness looked like. Jim and I courted for 4 years in the old-fashioned way. He'd pick me up for church every Sunday, take me to the county fair each summer, and sit with my family on the front porch during those warm Ohio evenings. When I graduated from high school, I started working as a secretary at the bank downtown, while Jim took over more responsibilities at the hardware store. We saved every penny we could, dreaming of our future together. Grandpa Harry would joke that we were taking too long to get married, that in his day, young people didn't wait around when they found true love. The proposal came on my 20th birthday in 1972. Jim had asked Grandpa Harry for permission first, just like he was supposed to. They planned it together, those 2 men who meant everything to me. Jim proposed right there on Grandpa Harry's front porch swing, with the sunset painting the sky pink and orange behind us. Grandpa Harry watched from the kitchen window, wiping away tears when I said yes. The engagement ring was simple, a small diamond that caught the light when I moved my hand, but it felt like the most precious thing in the world. Planning our wedding became a family affair. Since my parents worked such long hours, Grandpa Harry stepped in to help with everything. He drove me to the bridal shop in the next town over to find my dress, a simple white gown with lace sleeves and pearl buttons down the back. He helped me address invitations at his kitchen table, his careful handwriting filling out envelope after envelope. When I worried about the cost of the reception, he insisted on paying for everything, saying his granddaughter deserved a perfect wedding day. The ceremony was planned for Saturday afternoon at Springfield Methodist Church, where 3 generations of our family had been married. The reception would be held right there at Grandpa Harry's farm, in the big red barn that he spent weeks cleaning and decorating with white lights and wildflowers. As the wedding approached, I felt like I was living in a dream. I had the love of my life, a beautiful dress, and a celebration planned at the place that meant more to me than anywhere else on earth. Grandpa Harry seemed as excited as I was, maybe more so. He talked constantly about walking me down the aisle, about the speech he planned to give at the reception, about how proud he was of the woman I'd become. My parents would be there, of course, but everyone understood that Grandpa Harry was really the one giving me away. He'd raised me more than anyone else had. The week before the wedding, I moved temporarily into Grandpa Harry's farmhouse so we could handle all the last-minute preparations together. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jim was staying with his parents across town, following the tradition that the bride and groom shouldn't see each other the night before the wedding. The barn looked magical, transformed with hundreds of white lights that twinkled like stars. Tables were set up with mason jars full of wildflowers, and a small stage was ready for the local band that would play during dinner. Everything was perfect, exactly as I'd dreamed it would be. Friday evening, the night before my wedding, felt surreal. I remember standing in the guest bedroom where I'd slept countless nights as a child, looking at my wedding dress hanging on the closet door. Tomorrow I would become Mrs. James Mitchell. Tomorrow my real life would begin. I'd taken a long bath, washed my hair, and painted my nails a soft pink color. Grandpa Harry had gone to bed early, saying he wanted to be rested for the big day. I remember feeling so grateful for everything he'd done, for the man who'd stepped in when my parents couldn't, for the grandfather who'd made my wedding dreams come true. I was sitting at the vanity in my room, brushing my hair and thinking about tomorrow, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. It was late, probably close to 11 o'clock, and I assumed Grandpa Harry was just getting a glass of water from the feedy kitchen. But then my bedroom door opened without a knock, and he stepped inside wearing his old blue bathrobe. Something about the way he looked at me made my stomach tighten with an unfamiliar fear. "Rosie," he said, using the pet name he'd called me since childhood, but his voice sounded different somehow. Thicker. Strange. "Tomorrow you're getting married." I turned in my chair to face him, suddenly very aware that I was wearing only my nightgown, a simple cotton thing that covered me completely but still felt too revealing under his gaze. "Yes, Grandpa. I'm so excited. Thank you again for everything you've done." He stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that made my heart race for reasons I didn't understand. "You're going to be Jim's wife," he continued, his eyes moving over me in a way that made my skin crawl. "But before you belong to him, there's something we need to talk about, something I need to teach you." I felt confused and frightened, though I couldn't have explained. Why? This was my grandfather, the man who'd protected me my entire life. But something in his voice, in the way he was looking at me, felt wrong. "What do you mean, Grandpa? It's late. Maybe we should talk tomorrow after the wedding." He shook his head, taking another step closer. "No, Rosie, this can't wait. Tomorrow will be too late." His hand reached out to touch my hair, and I instinctively pulled back. "You're so beautiful, just like your grandmother was when she was young. But there are things about being a wife that no one's taught you, things a man needs from his woman." The way he said those words made me feel sick to my stomach. I stood up from the vanity chair, putting it between us. "Grandpa Harry, I think you should go back to your room. We're both tired." But instead of leaving, He moved around the chair, reaching for me with hands that had once felt safe, but now filled me with terror. "Don't be afraid, Rosie. I'm going to teach you what Jim will expect. What all husbands expect from their wives on their wedding night." When his hands touched my shoulders, I tried to step away, but he gripped me firmly. "Grandpa, please stop. This isn't right." "Shh," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "This is how it's always been done in our family. How my father taught me about my mother before I married your grandmother. It's tradition, Rosie. It's my responsibility to prepare you." I knew with every fiber of my being that this was not tradition, not normal, not right. But I was trapped in this room with a man who was so much stronger than me, so much bigger, and who had complete power over me. When I tried to move toward the door, he blocked my path. When I opened my mouth to scream, he covered it with his hand, pressing so hard I could barely breathe. "If you make noise, you'll ruin everything," he hissed in my ear. "The wedding, your reputation, Jim's family's respect for you, is that what you want? To destroy your future because you couldn't be grateful for what I'm doing for you?" Tears streamed down my face as I shook my head. I didn't want to ruin anything. I just wanted him to stop, to go back to being the grandfather I loved, to let me go to sleep so I could wake up and marry Jim and pretend this nightmare had never happened. But Grandpa Harry didn't stop. For the next hour, in that room where I'd felt safe and loved for so many years, he stole something from me that I could never get back. He touched me in ways that made me feel dirty and ashamed. He hurt me while telling me it was for my own good, that I needed to learn, that this was what love looked like between a man and a woman. When I cried, he told me to be quiet. When I tried to fight, he held me down with strength that reminded me how helpless I really was. When it was finally over, he straightened his bathrobe and looked down at me with eyes that seemed almost satisfied. "Now you'll be ready for Jim," he said calmly, as if he'd just given me a cooking lesson or taught me how to change a tire. "You'll know what to expect, what to do. He'll never know you weren't pure on your wedding night because I've prepared you properly." He left me there on the floor of my childhood bedroom, broken and sobbing and completely lost. I lay there for hours, unable to move, unable to think clearly, unable to understand how the man I trusted most in the world had become a monster in the space of a single evening. My wedding dress hung on the closet door like a ghost, mocking me with its innocence and promise of happiness. Dawn was breaking when I finally managed to stand up and stumble to the bathroom. I turned the shower as hot as I could stand it and scrubbed my skin until it was raw and bleeding. But I couldn't wash away the feeling of his hands on me, couldn't erase the memory of what he'd done. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a stranger, someone broken and used and dirty. How could I marry Jim like this? How could I walk down that aisle on the arm of the man who destroyed me? How could I pretend to be pure and happy when I felt like I was dying inside? But what choice did I have? The church was decorated. The guests would arrive in a few hours. The food was prepared. If I called off the wedding, everyone would want to know why. And what could I possibly say? That my beloved grandfather, the man everyone respected and admired, had violated me the night before my wedding? Who would believe such a terrible accusation against such a good man? I would be ruined, disgraced, and for what? It wouldn't change what had happened. It wouldn't give me back what he'd taken. So I put on my wedding dress with hands that shook so badly I could barely fasten the buttons. I did my hair and makeup, covering the bruises on my neck with powder, forcing my face into expressions that looked like joy. And when Grandpa Harry appeared at my door in his best suit, smiling and acting as if nothing had happened, I took his arm and let him walk me down the aisle of Springfield Methodist Church, while 200 people watched and smiled and thought they were witnessing the happiest day of my life. The wedding ceremony passed like a blur of faces and voices that seemed to echo from somewhere far away. I stood at that altar next to Jim, feeling like I was watching someone else's life unfold. When Pastor Williams asked if I took James to be my husband, my voice sounded hollow and strange when I said yes. Jim's eyes were shining with tears of happiness, and I wanted desperately to feel that same joy, but all I could feel was emptiness and shame. When he kissed me to seal our marriage, I had to fight the urge to pull away, because his gentle touch reminded me of hands that had been anything but gentle just hours before. The reception at Grandpa Harry's farm should have been magical. The barn looked exactly as I'd dreamed, with those twinkling lights casting a warm glow over everything. The local band played all our favorite songs, and guests filled the tables, laughing and celebrating our new marriage. But I felt like I was moving through thick fog, smiling when people spoke to me, dancing when Jim led me to the floor, but not really present for any of it. Grandpa Harry gave his speech about watching me grow up, about how proud he was of the woman I'd become, about how lucky Jim was to have found such a special girl. Everyone applauded and wiped away tears, and I had to stand there and smile while the man who'd destroyed me accepted their praise for being such a wonderful grandfather. Jim noticed something was wrong during our first dance. He held me close and whispered in my ear, asking if I was feeling all right, if I was just tired from all the excitement. I told him I was fine, just overwhelmed by everything, and he kissed my forehead with such tenderness that I nearly broke down crying right there on the dance floor. How could I tell this sweet, innocent man that his new wife had been ruined by her own grandfather? How could I explain that the woman he'd married was already broken and dirty and used? Our honeymoon was supposed to be 3 days at a cabin by Lake Erie, a modest trip that was all we could afford but felt like paradise to us. Jim had planned everything so carefully, bringing along groceries and flowers and even a bottle of champagne that his father had given him. That first night, as newlyweds, when he tried to touch me with love and gentleness, I couldn't stop my body from trembling. Every caress reminded me of Grandpa Harry's hands. Every kiss brought back the memory of that horrible night. Jim was confused and worried, asking what was wrong, if he was hurting me, if I needed more time. I made excuses about being nervous, about it being my first time, but inside I was screaming because it wasn't my first time anymore. That had been stolen from me along with everything else. I became very good at pretending during those early months of marriage. I learned to smile when people congratulated us on our wedding, to act happy when Jim talked about our future together, to hide the nightmares that woke me up several nights a week. Jim thought I was just adjusting to married life, to sharing a bed and a home with another person. He was patient and kind, never pushing when I pulled away, never demanding explanations when I became distant and quiet. But I could see the hurt in his eyes when I flinched at his touch, the confusion when I stared off into space during conversations, the worry when I jumped at sudden noises or unexpected movements. The worst part was still having to see Grandpa, Harry, regularly. In a town as small as Springfield, and with him being such an important part of my family, there was no way to avoid him. He came to Sunday dinners at our little house, helped Jim with projects around the property, and continued to act like the loving grandfather he'd always been. He never mentioned that night, never acknowledged what he'd done, never showed any sign of guilt or remorse. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with what almost seemed like satisfaction, as if he was pleased with his handiwork, proud of what he'd accomplished. Those looks made me feel sick to my stomach, but I couldn't say anything because who would believe that this respected man, this pillar of the community, had done something so horrible? My relationship with Jim began to deteriorate slowly but steadily. He tried so hard to understand why his new wife seemed sad and withdrawn, why she couldn't seem to enjoy the physical intimacy that should have been natural for newlyweds. He suggested I see Dr. Patterson in town, thinking maybe I had some kind of medical problem that was making me uncomfortable. When that revealed nothing wrong, he wondered if I was having second thoughts about our marriage, if I regretted choosing him. The pain in his voice when he asked these questions made me want to tell him everything, but I couldn't find the words. How do you explain to someone you love that you've been contaminated, that you're not the pure and innocent girl he thought he was marrying? I threw myself into keeping house and working at the bank, trying to stay busy enough that I wouldn't have time to think about what had happened. But the memories followed me everywhere. When I was making dinner and heard footsteps on the front porch, my heart would race with panic until I realized it was just Jim coming home from work. When customers at the bank leaned too close to my desk, I would break out in a cold sweat and have to excuse myself to the ladies' room. Sleep became my enemy because that's when the nightmares came, vivid dreams where I was trapped in that bedroom again, unable to escape, unable to scream, unable to wake up. 6 months after our wedding, Jim finally confronted me directly. We were sitting at our kitchen table after another silent dinner, and he reached across to take my hand. When I automatically pulled away, something in his face changed. "Rose," he said quietly, "I can't pretend anymore that everything is fine. You haven't been the same since our wedding day. You barely let me touch you. You jump when I come into a room, and sometimes I catch you staring at nothing with the saddest expression I've ever seen. I love you more than anything in this world, but I feel like I'm losing you a little more each day. Please tell me what's wrong so I can help fix it." I looked into his earnest blue eyes and felt my heart breaking all over again. This good, sweet man deserved so much better than a broken wife who couldn't give him the love and intimacy he craved. He deserved someone whole and untainted, someone who could share his bed without thinking of another man's hands, someone who could build a real marriage with him instead of just going through the motions. But I still couldn't tell him the truth. Instead, I made up some story about feeling overwhelmed by married life, about needing time to adjust to our new responsibilities. He accepted this explanation because he wanted to believe it, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Things got worse when I started having panic attacks at random times. I'd be working at the bank or shopping for groceries when suddenly I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but shake and cry. The first time it happened at work, Mrs. Henderson from the next desk over had to drive me home because I was in no condition to manage it myself. Jim rushed home from the hardware store to find me curled up on our bed, still trembling and unable to explain what had triggered such a reaction. He held me while I cried, stroking my hair and whispering reassurances, but I could feel his confusion and helplessness radiating through his touch. Grandpa Harry seemed to enjoy these visits too. Our house even more after he noticed how uncomfortable I'd become around him. He'd make a point of hugging me extra long when he arrived, his hands lingering in places they shouldn't, his voice taking on that same thick quality I remembered from that terrible night. During dinner conversations, he'd make comments that seemed innocent to everyone else but carried double meanings that made my skin crawl. "Rose looks a little pale," he'd say to Jim. "Maybe married life is wearing her out more than she expected." Or he'd pat my shoulder and add, "Don't worry, Rosie. It takes time for a woman to learn what her husband needs. You'll figure it out eventually." Jim started to notice these interactions and became protective in a way that both touched and terrified me. He'd step closer to my side when Grandpa Harry tried to hug me, or change the subject when his comments became too personal. I could see him watching the dynamics between us with growing suspicion, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what was wrong. One evening after Grandpa Harry had left, Jim asked me directly if my grandfather had ever done anything to make me uncomfortable. My heart nearly stopped beating at the question, and I must have looked guilty because Jim's expression immediately became more concerned. But I denied everything, told him he was imagining things, convinced him that I was just still adjusting to married life and taking everything too seriously. The isolation became overwhelming. I felt like I was drowning in secrets and shame, unable to connect with my husband, unable to confide in anyone, unable to escape the memories that plagued me day and night. I started avoiding social gatherings where Grandpa Harry might be present, making excuses about feeling sick or having too much work to catch up on. This only made people worry more about my health and state of mind, which led to more questions I couldn't answer honestly. The women at church began whispering about how thin I'd gotten, how quiet I'd become, how different I seemed from the happy bride they remembered from just months before. My parents noticed the change too, though they were still so busy with work that they didn't have much time to investigate. During their occasional visits, my mother would comment on how tired I looked, how I needed to eat more, how marriage clearly agreed with me less than she'd hoped. These observations felt like knives in my chest because I wanted so desperately to tell her what had happened, to have her hold me and protect me the way mothers are supposed to protect their daughters. But I knew that if I told her the truth about Grandpa Harry, it would destroy our entire family. He'd been the cornerstone of our lives for so long that accusing him of such a horrible crime would tear everything apart. The guilt was almost as destructive as the trauma itself. I felt guilty for not telling Jim the truth, for letting him think there was something wrong with our marriage when the problem was entirely with me. I felt guilty for avoiding family gatherings and hurting people's feelings with my distance. I felt guilty for being unable to give my husband the physical intimacy he deserved, for making him feel rejected and unwanted when he'd done nothing wrong. Most of all, I felt guilty for allowing Grandpa Harry to continue being seen as this wonderful man when I knew what kind of monster he really was underneath that gentle facade. Winter arrived early that year, and the gray skies and bare trees seemed to match my internal landscape perfectly. I found myself staring out our kitchen window for hours at a time, watching the snow fall and feeling as frozen and lifeless as the world outside. Jim would come home from work to find me sitting in the same position he'd left me in that morning, dinner unprepared, laundry undone, the house cold because I'd forgotten to tend the fire. He never complained or criticized, but I could see the worry lines deepening around his eyes as he watched his wife disappear a little more each day. One particularly dark December evening, Jim sat down across from me at the kitchen table and took both my hands in his. "Rose," he said gently, "I've been thinking a lot about what's been happening with us, and I've come to a decision. I think we need to talk to Pastor Williams together. Not because I think there's anything wrong with you, but because I think you're carrying some kind of burden that's too heavy for you to handle alone. Whatever it is, whatever happened, you don't have to face it by yourself anymore. I'm your husband, and that means your pain is my pain. Your problems are my problems. Let me help you." His words were spoken with such love and sincerity that I almost broke down and told him everything right then and there. But the fear was stronger than the desire for relief. What if he didn't believe me? What if he thought I was making it up or exaggerating what had happened? What if he decided that a wife who'd been violated by her own grandfather was too damaged to stay married to? What if telling the truth meant losing the one good thing I still had in my life? Instead of confessing, I made another excuse about the adjustment to married life being harder than I'd expected, about feeling overwhelmed by adult responsibilities, about needing time to find my footing in this new role. Jim accepted this explanation because he loved me and wanted to believe that whatever was wrong could be fixed with patience and understanding. But I could see in his eyes that he knew there was more to the story, something deeper and darker that I wasn't sharing with him. That night, lying in bed next to my sleeping husband, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. I decided that I would never tell anyone what Grandpa Harry had done to me. I would carry this secret to my grave rather than risk destroying the lives of everyone I loved. I would learn to live with the memories and the pain, would find a way to be the wife Jim deserved, would somehow build a normal life on the foundation of this terrible lie. I had no idea then how impossible that would prove to be, how secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch, how trauma doesn't just disappear because you will it to. The months that followed were a slow descent into a kind of living death. I went through the motions of being a wife, a bank employee, a member of the community. But inside I felt hollow and broken. I smiled when people spoke to me, cooked meals for my husband, attended church services where Grandpa Harry sat in his usual pew, looking like the righteous man everyone believed him to be. But I was dying inside, suffocating under the weight of silence and shame, drowning in memories that played on an endless loop in my mind. Jim tried everything he could think of to reach me. He brought me flowers, planned special dinners, suggested trips to visit relatives in other towns. He was gentle and patient when I couldn't respond to his physical advances, never pushing or demanding, always trying to make me feel safe and loved. But nothing could penetrate the wall I'd built around myself, the fortress of silence that protected my terrible secret but also kept out any possibility of healing or happiness. By our first wedding anniversary, I had become a ghost of the woman Jim had married. I weighed barely 100 pounds, spoke only when directly addressed, and spent most of my free time staring out windows or lying in bed with the covers pulled over my head. Jim had stopped trying to understand what was wrong and was simply focused on keeping me alive and functional. He took over most of the household responsibilities, covered for me at social events when I couldn't manage to attend, and held me when the nightmares woke me up screaming in the middle of the night. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon in late spring, when Grandpa Harry stopped by for his usual visit. I was in the kitchen preparing coffee when I heard him talking to Jim in the living room about my condition. "She's been like this for over a year now," Jim was saying, his voice heavy with exhaustion and worry. "I don't know what else to do. She won't talk to me about what's wrong, won't see a doctor, won't even consider that there might be help available. I'm watching my wife waste away, and I feel completely powerless to stop it." Grandpa Harry's response made my blood run cold. "Some women just aren't cut out for married life," he said in that same calm, reasonable voice he'd used that night in my bedroom. "Some girls seem strong and independent when they're young, but they crumble under the pressure of adult responsibilities. Maybe Rose is one of those women who would be better off in a more protected environment, somewhere with people who can take care of her properly." The implication was clear. He was suggesting that I was mentally unstable, that I needed to be committed to some kind of institution, that my breakdown was evidence of inherent weakness, rather than the result of what he'd done to me, the casual cruelty of it. The way he could sit in my living room and discuss my destruction as if it were a natural phenomenon rather than his deliberate creation filled me with a rage I hadn't felt since that terrible night. I stood in that kitchen doorway, listening to my grandfather manipulate my husband into believing that I was fundamentally broken. And something inside me finally snapped. Not in the direction of further collapse, but toward a cold, hard determination that surprised me with its intensity. I realized that my silence wasn't protecting anyone. It was only protecting him, allowing him to continue being seen as this wonderful man while I suffered the consequences of his actions. It was time for that to change, regardless of what it might cost me. That rage burned inside me for days, a white-hot flame that I carefully concealed behind the same mask of broken silence I'd been wearing for over a year. But underneath that familiar facade, something fundamental had shifted. I began to notice things I'd been too consumed by my own pain to see clearly before. The way Grandpa Harry's eyes lingered on young girls at church, following them with the same hungry look I remembered from that night. The way he positioned himself to be alone with teenage nieces and family friends during gatherings, always finding excuses to help them with their coats or walk them to their cars. The uncomfortable way some of the younger women in our family acted around him, that subtle flinching and avoidance that I now recognized as the body's instinctive response to danger. I started paying attention to conversations I'd previously ignored, listening for clues about whether I was his only victim or if there were others suffering in silence just as I had been. During a family barbecue at my Aunt Helen's house, I overheard my cousin Sarah talking quietly to her mother about not wanting to stay overnight at Grandpa Harry's farm anymore. She was only 14, with the same blonde hair and blue eyes I'd had at her age, and the way she fidgeted and looked down when his name came up made my stomach clench with recognition. When Aunt Helen asked why she didn't want to visit, Sarah just shrugged and said she felt too old for spending time on the farm, but I saw the truth in her troubled expression. I began watching him more carefully during family gatherings, noting how he maneuvered conversations and situations to his advantage. He had a talent for presenting himself as the helpful grandfather figure while gradually isolating potential victims from the safety of the group. I watched him offer to show my teenage cousin Rebecca the new calf in the barn, saw how he positioned himself between her and the exit, how his hand rested just a little too long on her shoulder when he guided her toward the door. The sick familiarity of his tactics made me dizzy with anger and fear, but it also gave me something I'd lost completely: a sense of purpose. The realization that other girls were likely suffering what I'd endured created a moral imperative that was stronger than my fear of exposure. Every day I remained silent was another day he had free access to potential victims. Another day some innocent child might experience the same violation that had destroyed my life. I couldn't live with that knowledge, couldn't continue protecting myself at the expense of others who were just as vulnerable as I'd been. But I also knew that simply speaking out wouldn't be enough. In a small town like Springfield, accusations against someone as respected as Grandpa Harry would be met with skepticism and disbelief unless I had evidence to support my claims. I started what I privately called my investigation, approaching it with the same methodical care that Jim used when solving problems at the hardware store. I began by documenting everything I could remember about that night in 1974, writing down every detail no matter how painful or embarrassing. The clothes he'd been wearing, the specific words he'd used, the way the room had smelled, the sounds I'd heard from outside the window. I wrote about the way he'd justified his actions, his claims about family tradition and preparing me for marriage, his threats about what would happen if I told anyone. I filled page after page with memories I'd tried desperately to forget, forcing myself to relive that horror in order to build a case that might prevent others from experiencing it. Next, I started paying closer attention to family history and dynamics, looking for patterns that might reveal other incidents of abuse. I visited older relatives under the guise of wanting to learn more about our family's past, asking innocent-seeming questions about childhood memories and family traditions. During a conversation with my great-aunt Martha, who was Grandpa Harry's older sister, I learned something that chilled me to the bone. She mentioned offhandedly that their father had been a stern man who believed in old-fashioned discipline for the women in the family, and that Harry had always been his father's favorite son because he understood the importance of keeping females in their proper place. When I pressed for more details, Aunt Martha became uncomfortable and changed the subject, but not before mentioning that several of her female cousins had run away from home as teenagers, something that was highly unusual for girls from religious families in that era. One cousin, she said, had disappeared completely and never contacted the family again, despite having been very close to her siblings before her sudden departure. Another had married at 15 to a man twice her age, desperate to escape her home situation. These stories painted a picture of a family where the abuse of women might have been normalized across generations, where what Grandpa Harry had done to me was perhaps not an isolated incident, but part of a long-standing pattern. I also began researching what legal options might be available to me if I decided to come forward. This proved more challenging. In an era before widespread awareness of sexual assault issues, when most people still believed that such crimes only happened to women who somehow invited them. I discreetly visited the library in the next town over, spending hours reading legal texts and case studies, trying to understand what evidence would be required to build a credible case against someone like Grandpa Harry. What I learned was discouraging. Sexual assault cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute even when reported immediately, and cases involving family members were often dismissed entirely as domestic disputes rather than serious crimes. The Research also revealed the devastating impact that coming forward would likely have on my own life. Women who accused male relatives of sexual assault were often ostracized by their families and communities, labeled as troublemakers or mentally unstable, and subjected to character assassination designed to undermine their credibility. I would probably lose not only my relationship with extended family members, but potentially my job at the bank, my standing in the church, and my position in the community. Jim would be forced to choose between supporting his wife's accusations or maintaining his relationships with people who refused to believe them. But the more I learned about the likelihood that other girls were being victimized, the more convinced I became that I had to act regardless of the personal cost. I started observing Grandpa Harry's interactions with young females more systematically, keeping a detailed journal of concerning behavior. I noted when he volunteered to drive teenage girls home from church events, how he insisted on helping with youth group activities despite having no official role, the way he found excuses to visit families with daughters in my age range. I documented the uncomfortable body language I observed in some of these girls, the way they seemed to shrink away from his attention while still being polite and respectful as they'd been taught. One incident in particular convinced me that my suspicions were correct. During a church potluck dinner, I watched Grandpa Harry approach my 15-year-old neighbor Jessica, who was helping to clean up in the kitchen. Most of the other adults were in the main hall socializing, leaving the kitchen relatively isolated. I positioned myself where I could observe without being seen and watched as he cornered her near the sink, standing closer than was appropriate, and speaking in the same low, intimate tone I remembered from that terrible night. Jessica's face went pale, and she kept glancing toward the door as if looking for an escape route. When she tried to step around him, he blocked her path with his body, just as he'd done to me. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I saw Jessica's hands begin to shake as she continued washing dishes, her movements becoming increasingly frantic and clumsy. When she dropped a glass and it shattered on the floor, Grandpa Harry immediately knelt down to help her clean up the pieces, his hands brushing against hers repeatedly in the process. The whole interaction lasted only a few minutes, but I recognized every element of it from my own experience. The isolation, the intimidation, the inappropriate touching disguised as helpfulness, the way he made her feel responsible for managing his behavior. When other adults finally entered the kitchen, Grandpa Harry's demeanor immediately shifted back to that of the kindly grandfather figure everyone expected him to be. He joked about how clumsy young people could be and offered to drive Jessica home since her parents had already left the church. The terror that flashed across her face at this suggestion confirmed my worst fears. I quickly intervened, offering to take Jessica home myself since it was on my way, and saw the relief in her eyes when she accepted my offer instead of his. During the drive to her house, I wanted desperately to ask Jessica if Grandpa Harry had ever made her uncomfortable, but I couldn't find the words. How do you ask a teenage girl if your grandfather has been inappropriate with her? How do you explain your suspicions without revealing why you have them? Instead, I settled for telling her that if anyone ever made her feel unsafe or uncomfortable, she should trust her instincts and find a way to remove herself from the situation. I gave her my phone number and told her she could call me any time if she needed help with anything, no matter how small or silly it might seem. The weight of carrying these suspicions along with my own trauma was almost unbearable. I felt like I was walking around with a ticking bomb in my chest, knowing that an explosion was inevitable, but not knowing when or how it would happen. My relationship with Jim continued to deteriorate as I became even more withdrawn and anxious, unable to explain why I was suddenly spending so much time away from home on mysterious errands, why I jumped every time the phone rang, why I seemed to be watching and evaluating everyone around us with new suspicion. Jim tried repeatedly to draw me out to understand what was happening to the woman he'd married. One evening in early autumn, he sat me down at our kitchen table and spoke with a directness that cut through all my evasions. "Rose, I love you more than my own life, but I'm losing you, and I don't know how to stop it. You've been disappearing, piece by piece for almost 2 years now. and I'm starting to think that whatever happened to change you is something you're never going to share with me. If that's true, if you've decided that you can't trust me with whatever burden you're carrying, then maybe I need to accept that our marriage isn't what I thought it was." The pain in his voice broke something inside me. This good, faithful man had done nothing but love me and support me through the worst period of my life, and I was repaying him with secrets and withdrawal and the slow death of our relationship. He deserved to know why his wife had become a stranger, deserved to understand that his patient love hadn't failed, but had been up against forces beyond his control. But I also knew that telling him the truth would transfer my burden to his shoulders, would force him to carry the knowledge of what Grandpa Harry had done and decide how to handle that information. That night, lying awake next to my sleeping husband, I made a decision that would change everything. I would tell Jim the truth about what had happened on our wedding night, not because I thought it would fix our marriage, but because he deserved to know what he was fighting against. I would trust him with my secret and let him help me decide what to do next. If that meant losing him, if the knowledge of what had been done to me made me too damaged for him to love, then at least he would understand why our marriage had failed, rather than spending the rest of his life wondering what he'd done wrong. I waited until the following Saturday, when we had the whole day to ourselves with no interruptions or obligations. I made his favorite breakfast and coffee, then asked him to sit with me in our living room where we could talk privately. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my coffee cup, and my voice cracked when I began to speak. "Jim, there's something I need to tell you about our wedding night. Something that happened before the ceremony that changed everything for me." The concern in his eyes immediately intensified, and I could see him preparing himself for whatever revelation was coming. I took a deep breath and began with the simplest, most factual statement I could manage. My grandfather came into my room that night, and he hurt me. He did things to me that a grandfather should never do to his granddaughter, things that made me feel dirty and ashamed and broken. I've been carrying this secret for almost 2 years because I was afraid of what would happen if I told anyone, afraid that no one would believe me or that it would destroy our family. The silence that followed my words was deafening. Jim's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a rage so pure and intense that it frightened me. His hands clenched into fists on his knees, and when he spoke, his voice was barely controlled. "Are you telling me that Harry assaulted you the night before our wedding? In his own house while you were staying there to prepare for our ceremony?" I nodded, unable to speak past the tears that were finally flowing freely after being held back for so long. Jim's reaction was everything I'd hoped for and feared at the same time. He believed me instantly, without question or doubt, and his anger was directed entirely at Grandpa Harry rather than at me. But I could also see the devastation in his eyes as he realized what I'd been going through alone. How much I'd suffered while he'd been trying unsuccessfully to understand and help me. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking with emotion. "Why didn't you trust me with this? We could have faced it together instead of you carrying it alone all this time." I tried to explain my fears about not being believed, about destroying the family, about being seen as damaged goods that no decent man would want to stay married to. But even as I spoke the words, I could see how inadequate they sounded, how my decision to suffer in silence had hurt not only me, but also the person I loved most in the world. Jim reached for my hands, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, I didn't flinch away from his touch. "Rose," he said firmly, "what that monster did to you doesn't change how I feel about you. It doesn't make you dirty or broken or any less worthy of love. It makes me want to kill him with my bare hands. But it doesn't change anything between us except that now I understand why you've been in so much pain." His words were like water to someone dying of thirst, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds that had darkened my world for so long. For the first time since that terrible night, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely alone. Maybe there was someone who could help me carry this burden without judging me for it. We held each other and cried together, mourning not only what had been done to me, but also the 2 years of our marriage that had been stolen by my silence and shame. When we finally separated, Jim asked the question I'd been dreading. "What do you want to do about this? Do you want to go to the police? Do you want to confront him? Do you want to tell your parents?" I explained my growing suspicions about other potential victims, my observations of his behavior with young girls, my fear that staying silent was enabling him to continue hurting others. Jim listened with increasing anger and determination, and when I finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Then we have to stop him," he said simply. "I don't care what it costs us or how difficult it makes our lives. We can't let him keep hurting children just because it's easier to stay quiet. We'll figure out how to build a case against him, how to protect other potential victims, how to make sure he pays for what he's done to you and probably others." For the first time in almost 2 years, I felt hope stirring in my chest. I wasn't alone anymore. I had an ally, someone who believed me and was willing to fight alongside me for justice. The road ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but we would travel it together. The silence that had nearly destroyed me was finally broken, and in its place was the beginning of something that felt like strength. The decision to confront Grandpa Harry didn't come easily or quickly. Jim and I spent weeks planning our approach, researching legal procedures, and building our courage for what we knew would be the most difficult conversation of our lives. We contacted a lawyer in Columbus, a woman named Patricia Wells, who specialized in cases involving sexual assault. She was honest about the challenges we faced, proving a crime that had occurred 2 years earlier with no physical evidence, and no witnesses would be nearly impossible, especially against someone with Grandpa Harry's reputation in the community. But Mrs. Wells also told us something that changed everything. She said that in her experience, men who commit these types of crimes rarely have just one victim. If we could find other women who had been assaulted by Grandpa Harry, particularly if any of them were willing to come forward, we might be able to build a case that could actually result in criminal charges. She gave us guidance on how to approach potential victims, how to document our conversations, and how to protect ourselves legally as we gathered information. Armed with this professional advice, Jim and I began reaching out carefully to women in our extended family and community. This process was excruciating and often heartbreaking. Many of the women we spoke with initially denied that anything inappropriate had ever happened, either because they genuinely hadn't been victimized or because they weren't ready to discuss traumatic experiences with relative strangers. But gradually, we began to uncover a pattern of behavior that confirmed our worst fears. My cousin Sarah, the 14-year-old who had been reluctant to visit Grandpa Harry's farm, finally admitted to her mother that he had been touching her inappropriately during her overnight stays. She described incidents that were disturbingly similar to what I had experienced. The late-night visits to her room, the inappropriate touching disguised as affection, the threats about what would happen if she told anyone. Sarah's mother, my Aunt Helen, was devastated but also relieved to finally understand why her daughter had become so withdrawn and anxious in recent months. Even more shocking was the revelation that came from my great-aunt Martha. After weeks of gentle encouragement, she finally told me the truth about why several of our female relatives had left home as teenagers decades earlier. Grandpa Harry's father had indeed been abusive, but it wasn't just stern discipline, as she had originally described. He had sexually assaulted multiple daughters and granddaughters over many years, and the family had covered it up to protect their reputation. In the community, Grandpa Harry had witnessed this abuse as a child, and had apparently learned to see it as normal behavior for men in positions of power over vulnerable females. This generational pattern of abuse explained so much about Grandpa Harry's sense of entitlement and his confidence that he would never face consequences for his actions. He had grown up in a family where powerful men took what they wanted from weaker family members, and everyone else stayed silent to preserve the appearance of respectability. He had inherited not only the behavior, but also the belief system that justified it, the conviction that his victims were somehow complicit in their own victimization. We also discovered that Jessica, the teenage girl I had observed being cornered at the church potluck, had indeed been targeted by Grandpa Harry. When Jim's sister-in-law approached Jessica's family with our concerns, her parents initially reacted with anger and denial. But when they sat down with Jessica privately and asked direct questions about her interactions with Grandpa Harry, she broke down and revealed months of escalating inappropriate behavior. He had been offering her rides home from school, making excuses to visit when her parents weren't home, and gradually pushing boundaries in ways that made her feel uncomfortable and afraid. Jessica's parents were horrified, but also grateful that someone had noticed and spoken up before the situation escalated further. They immediately forbade any contact between Jessica and Grandpa Harry, and her father even went so far as to warn other parents in their church about potential concerns, though he was careful not to make specific accusations that could result in legal action against him. As we gathered more information and identified more victims, the scope of Grandpa Harry's crimes became increasingly clear. We had testimony from at least 4 different women spanning more than 3 decades, a pattern of behavior that demonstrated both the persistence and the escalation of his predatory activities. Mrs. Wells reviewed our documentation and agreed that we had enough evidence to file criminal charges, though she warned us that the legal process would be lengthy, difficult, and emotionally devastating for everyone involved. The hardest part was deciding how and when to confront Grandpa Harry directly. Mrs. Wells advised us to coordinate with local law enforcement so that any confession or admission could be properly documented and used in criminal proceedings. We arranged for Detective Robert Morrison from the Springfield Police Department to be present during our planned confrontation, hidden with recording equipment that would capture everything Grandpa Harry said. We chose to approach him at his farm on a Sunday afternoon when we knew he would be alone and relaxed. Jim and I drove out there together, both of us sick with nervousness but determined to see this through. The farm looked exactly as it always had, peaceful and pastoral, giving no hint of the horrors that had taken place within its boundaries. Grandpa Harry greeted us with his usual warm smile, commenting on how nice it was to see us together and how much better I looked compared to recent months. We sat in his living room, the same room where he had given speeches about family values and moral behavior, where he had played the role of the devoted grandfather for so many years. I looked around at the familiar furniture and decorations, the family photos on the mantelpiece, the Bible prominently displayed on the coffee table, and marveled at how effectively he had hidden his true nature behind this facade of respectability. Jim took the lead in our planned conversation, beginning with seemingly innocent questions about family history and Grandpa Harry's relationship with various relatives. We gradually steered the discussion toward his interactions with young women in the family, his role as a mentor and authority figure, his beliefs about the proper relationships between older men and their female dependents. Grandpa Harry seemed to enjoy the conversation initially, clearly pleased to be discussing topics where he felt knowledgeable and important. He spoke at length about the responsibilities of family patriarchs, the need to guide and educate younger family members, the importance of preparing young women for their eventual roles as wives and mothers. His language became increasingly paternalistic and controlling as he warmed to his subject, revealing attitudes about female autonomy and bodily rights that were deeply disturbing. When Jim finally asked directly about his educational activities, with young women in the family, Grandpa Harry's demeanor shifted slightly. He became more cautious in his responses, but he didn't deny anything. Instead, he began explaining his philosophy about the proper preparation of young women for adult relationships, using language that was both euphemistic and deeply revealing. Young girls today don't understand what will be expected of them as wives, he said, his voice taking on that same authoritative tone I remembered from that terrible night. Their mothers are too embarrassed to teach them properly. and they end up going to their marriage beds completely ignorant and unprepared. A caring grandfather has a responsibility to make sure his granddaughters understand what their husbands will need from them. The casual way he discussed violating the children in our family made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to remain calm and continue listening. Jim pressed him for more specific details about this education process, and Grandpa Harry became increasingly explicit in his descriptions. He talked about the importance of physical preparation, emotional conditioning, and psychological readiness for intimate relationships, using clinical language to describe what were clearly acts of sexual assault. When Jim asked specifically about his interactions with me before my wedding, Grandpa Harry showed no remorse or shame whatsoever. Instead, he expressed satisfaction with his work and even a degree of pride in his methodology. Rose was particularly resistant at first, he said matter-of-factly. She had some very unrealistic ideas about marriage and intimacy, probably picked up from those romance novels girls her age like to read. But I was patient with her, helped her understand what would be expected, made sure she was properly prepared for her wedding night. The casual cruelty of his words, the complete absence of any recognition that he had done something wrong, confirmed everything we had suspected about his mindset. He genuinely believed that he had the right to sexually assault the young women in our family, that his actions were not only justified but actually beneficial to his victims. This delusional sense of righteousness made him even more dangerous because it meant he would never voluntarily stop his predatory behavior. When Jim pushed him about the other girls in our family, Grandpa Harry became slightly more defensive, but still didn't deny anything. He talked about his ongoing responsibilities to educate and guide the younger generation, his concerns about the moral decline of modern society, his determination to ensure that the women in our family would be properly prepared for their adult roles regardless of what their parents might or might not teach them. Detective Morrison had heard enough. He emerged from his hiding place and formally arrested Grandpa Harry on multiple charges of sexual assault, child abuse, and related crimes. The look of shock and outrage on Grandpa Harry's face when he realized he had been recorded confessing to his crimes was almost worth all the pain and suffering he had caused. For the first time in his life, he was facing real consequences for his actions, and he clearly couldn't believe that his victims had found the courage to challenge his authority. The arrest created an immediate uproar in our family and community. Many people simply refused to believe that someone they had known and respected for decades could be capable of such terrible crimes. Others were angry with us for destroying a good man's reputation over what they insisted must be misunderstandings or exaggerations. The social pressure to drop the charges and let the family handle the matter privately was intense and constant. But we also found unexpected sources of support. Several community members came forward with their own concerns about Grandpa Harry's behavior, stories of inappropriate comments or actions that had made them uncomfortable, but that they had dismissed as harmless eccentricity from an elderly man. Some parents admitted that they had instinctively avoided leaving their daughters alone with him, though they hadn't been able to articulate why he made them uneasy. The legal proceedings stretched on for months, during which our entire family was effectively torn apart. Those who supported us were ostracized by those who refused to believe the charges, and longtime friendships were destroyed by the divisions. Jim and I faced constant harassment and social pressure, including anonymous threats and demands that we recant our accusations and restore Grandpa Harry's reputation. But we also experienced something we hadn't expected: a growing sense of empowerment and purpose. Every day that Grandpa Harry remained in jail was another day that the children in our community were safe from his predatory behavior. Every woman who came forward with her own story was another step toward justice for all his victims. Every person who chose to believe us rather than protect a predator was a victory for truth over the comfortable lies that had enabled his crimes for so long. The trial itself was a grueling ordeal that required me to testify in explicit detail about what Grandpa Harry had done to me on my wedding night. Reliving that trauma in a public courtroom facing his lawyer's attempts to discredit my character and my memories, answering invasive questions about my mental health and sexual history. All of it was almost unbearable. But I kept thinking about Sarah, about Jessica, about all the other potential victims who would be safe if we could successfully convict him. When the jury finally returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had ever experienced. Justice had been served, not just for me, but for every girl and woman he had violated over the decades. Grandpa Harry was sentenced to 15 years in prison, which meant he would likely die behind bars given his advanced age. The monster, who had terrorized my family for generations, would never have the opportunity to hurt another child. The victory came at an enormous personal cost. Our extended family was permanently fractured, with some members never speaking to us again. We lost friends, faced ongoing social ostracism, and dealt with continued harassment from those who blamed us for destroying a respected family patriarch. But we also gained something invaluable: the knowledge that we had done the right thing, that we had protected future victims, even when it cost us everything. The years following Grandpa Harry's conviction were like learning to breathe again after nearly drowning. Jim and I faced the monumental task of rebuilding not just our marriage, but our entire understanding of family, trust, and healing. The first year was particularly difficult as we navigated the aftermath of the trial, the ongoing family divisions, and my own complicated journey toward recovery. But slowly, methodically, we began to construct a new life built on honesty and mutual support rather than secrets and shame. Therapy became an essential part of my healing process. Dr. Elizabeth Cameron, a psychologist in Columbus who specialized in trauma recovery, helped me understand that what had happened to me was not my fault, that my reactions and coping mechanisms had been normal responses to an abnormal situation. She taught me techniques for managing the nightmares and panic attacks that still plagued me, helped me develop healthy boundaries in relationships, and gradually guided me toward a place where I could discuss my trauma without being overwhelmed by it. Jim also attended therapy sessions, both individually and with me, to learn how to support a trauma survivor and process his own feelings of rage and helplessness about what had been done to his wife. Our marriage counselor, Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, helped us rebuild intimacy and trust in our relationship, teaching us new ways to communicate about difficult topics and creating safe spaces for physical and emotional connection. It was slow, sometimes frustrating work, but each small breakthrough felt like a miracle. One of the most profound aspects of my recovery was reconnecting with the other survivors in our family. Sarah, who was now 16 and dealing with her own trauma from Grandpa Harry's abuse, became like a younger sister to me. We supported each other through the difficult days, sharing coping strategies and providing mutual encouragement when the healing process felt overwhelming. Watching her regain her confidence and joy was incredibly healing for me as well, proof that recovery was possible even from the deepest wounds. Jessica's family remained grateful for our intervention, and over time, Jessica herself became an advocate for other young women in our community. She spoke at schools about recognizing inappropriate behavior from authority figures and trusting their instincts when adults made them uncomfortable. Her courage in turning her trauma into a tool for protecting others inspired me to consider how I might use my own experience to make a difference. In 1978, 4 years after Grandpa Harry's conviction, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to go back to school to study social work, with a focus on child protection and trauma recovery. At 26 years old, returning to education felt intimidating, but I was driven by a clear sense of purpose that hadn't existed in my life before. I wanted to help other survivors find their voices, to create systems that would protect vulnerable children, and to ensure that predators like Grandpa Harry could never again hide behind facades of respectability. Jim supported my educational goals completely, taking on extra responsibilities at the hardware store to help pay for my tuition. and adjusting his schedule so I could attend classes and complete fieldwork requirements. My parents, who had eventually come to believe and support my accusations against Grandpa Harry, also provided encouragement and practical assistance. The extended family members who had stood by us during the trial became my strongest advocates, celebrating each academic achievement as a victory for all of us. College was challenging in ways I hadn't expected. Studying trauma theory and child development forced me to examine my own experiences from new perspectives, which was sometimes emotionally difficult but ultimately empowering. I learned about the psychological mechanisms that allowed abuse to continue in families, the social factors that enabled predators to operate with impunity, and the intervention strategies that could break cycles of victimization. This knowledge helped me understand not only what had happened to me, but also how to prevent it from happening to others. My professors were impressed by the insight and passion I brought to my studies, and several encouraged me to consider graduate, school, and research opportunities. But I was more interested in direct service, in working face-to-face with children and families who were dealing with abuse and trauma. I completed internships at child protective services agencies and domestic violence shelters, learning practical skills while contributing to the safety and recovery of other survivors. After graduation in 1982, I was hired by the Ohio Department of Children's Services as a child protection specialist. My job involved investigating reports of abuse and neglect, removing children from dangerous situations when necessary, and connecting families with resources for healing and stability. It was emotionally demanding work that required me to witness and document horrific situations on a regular basis, but it also allowed me to make a tangible difference in the lives of vulnerable children. My own experience as a survivor gave me credibility and insight that enhanced my effectiveness in this role. Children and teenagers who had been abused often opened up to me more readily than they did to other social workers, perhaps sensing that I truly understood what they had endured. I developed specialized techniques for conducting sensitive interviews with young victims, creating safe environments where they could disclose trauma without feeling judged or pressured. One case, in particular, stands out in my memory as a turning point in my professional development. I was assigned to investigate allegations that a respected community leader in a small town outside Columbus was molesting his stepdaughter and several neighborhood children. The dynamics were eerily similar to what I had experienced with Grandpa Harry, a charismatic man with an impeccable public reputation using his position of authority to gain access to victims while intimidating them into silence. The parallels to my own situation were so strong that I initially worried I might be too emotionally involved to handle the case objectively. But my supervisor, who knew my background, encouraged me to trust my instincts and use my experience as a source of strength rather than vulnerability. Working with this family, I was able to help the children understand that they were not responsible for what had happened to them, that adults who hurt children are skilled at manipulation and deception, and that speaking the truth about abuse was an act of courage rather than betrayal. The case resulted in criminal convictions and the protection of multiple children. But more importantly for me, it demonstrated that my trauma could be transformed into a tool for healing others. Each child I helped, each family that found safety through my intervention, felt like a victory not just for them, but for every survivor who had ever struggled to find their voice. My work became a form of activism, a way of ensuring that the pain I had endured would serve a greater purpose. Jim and I decided to start our own family in 1984, 10 years after our wedding and long after we had given up hope that children were possible for us. The pregnancy was unexpected but deeply welcome, a sign that our lives had healed sufficiently to welcome new life. Our daughter Elizabeth was born in early 1985, followed by our son David in 1987, and our youngest daughter Margaret in 1990. Becoming a mother was both joyful and terrifying, as I struggled with fears about protecting my children from the dangers I knew existed in the world. Parenting required me to confront my trauma from yet another angle, as I worked to create the safe, loving environment for my children that I had been denied. I was perhaps overprotective at times, carefully screening babysitters and monitoring their interactions with any adult authority figures. But I also made sure my children understood their rights, knew they could always talk to me about anything that made them uncomfortable, and trusted that I would believe and protect them no matter what. Jim proved to be an extraordinary father, bringing the same patience and gentleness to parenting that he had shown during the darkest years of our marriage. Together, we created a home filled with open communication, unconditional love, and respect for boundaries. Our children grew up knowing they were valued and protected, but also understanding the realities of the world and their responsibility to look out for themselves and others. In 1995, I was promoted to supervisor within the Department of Children Services, giving me the opportunity to train new social workers and develop policies that would improve our response to child abuse cases. I specialized in training programs focused on recognizing and investigating sexual abuse, drawing on both my professional expertise and personal experience to educate others about the dynamics of these complex cases. My reputation in the field grew beyond Ohio as I began speaking at national conferences and contributing to professional journals about best practices in child protection. I was invited to consult on high-profile cases in other states, to review policies and procedures at child welfare agencies across the country, and to participate in research studies about trauma recovery and resilience. The scared, broken young woman who had once believed she would never amount to anything had become a nationally recognized expert in her field. But perhaps my proudest achievement was not professional, but personal, breaking the cycle of abuse that had plagued my family for generations. My children grew up safe and loved, went on to successful careers and healthy relationships, and are now raising their own children with the same values of respect and protection. When I look at my 7 grandchildren playing in my backyard, laughing and trusting and free from fear, I know that Grandpa Harry's legacy of violence ended with my generation. Grandpa Harry died in prison in 1991, 17 years after his conviction, and 6 years into his sentence. I felt no sadness at his passing, but also no particular satisfaction. He had become irrelevant to my life long before his death, a footnote in a story that had become about so much more than his crimes. His death was simply the closing of a chapter that had already ended for me years earlier. My parents both lived long enough to see me succeed professionally and personally, to witness the healing of our family and the safety of their grandchildren. Before my mother passed away in 2003, she told me that watching me transform my pain into purpose had been one of the greatest privileges of her life. My father, who died in 2008, said he was proud that I had found the courage to speak truth, even when it cost us everything. Today, at 72 years old, I can honestly say that I am grateful for every aspect of my journey, even the darkest parts. The trauma I experienced shaped me into someone capable of protecting others, gave me the empathy and insight necessary to heal families torn apart by abuse, and taught me the value of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. I would never wish such suffering on anyone, but I cannot regret experiences that allowed me to save so many other children from similar fates. The young woman who was violated on her wedding night and nearly destroyed by shame and silence grew into someone strong enough to stand up to monsters, wise enough to heal from trauma, and courageous enough to dedicate her life to protecting the innocent. That transformation was not easy or quick, but it was complete and lasting. I am living proof that survival is possible, that healing is achievable, and that even the deepest wounds can become sources of strength for ourselves and others. My story is not unique. Thousands of survivors have found ways to transform their trauma into tools for healing and protection. We are mothers and teachers, social workers and counselors, advocates and activists. We are the voices that refuse to stay silent, the hands that reach out to help others climb from the darkness, the hearts that insist on hope even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. We are stronger than we ever imagined possible, And we are using that strength to make the world safer for the children who come after us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.